So yeah, a few thoughts. There could be loads, and some principles that have helped to sort of guide us to this 2040 utopia. I mean, it's obviously at kind of conceptual level. Maybe we can talk about the practicalities a bit later. But yeah, I think that's what's called for sometimes. So getting into it, I think one of the big issues that we face with with journalism at the moment is that it focuses a lot on what is happening and not necessarily why it is happening. And obviously there's a kind of like a dispute sometimes about why it's happening. But I think that one thing that we would need to get to this 2040 place, or this imagined place, is to sort of talk about why things are happening in a way that will kind of like help deepen our understanding and not be this sort of like sense of being overwhelmed by this kind of like constant bombardment of like bleak facts that we're not able to kind of like set in the context of why it's happening, which in a way, through understanding why it's happening will help us to understand how we can change it or how we can affect it. And I think this is kind of there's a big issue actually this at the moment, and it's not just environment related. There's this phenomena of news avoidance where people are like, I'm just like switching off. I'm not looking at the news. I'm not opening my apps because I'm just getting all this information, but I feel disempowered by it because I don't really know what to do with it. So by asking and talking about why things are happening, we can sort of help people to not just know information, but to understand its significance and therefore like how to sort of like start to address it. Secondly, I think media should use language that is frank about what the seriousness of what is happening, as in like there's a massive climate crisis happening, and but also framing the issues as choices or options that we have for politicians and the public alike, and not just this sort of like inevitable sort of like, you know, pathway that we don't really have control over. And I think that's kind of one of the things that kind of relates to the first point, is like it just seems a bit remote and removed from us. But when we frame it as like this is happening and this is why it's happening, and now we have some options about how to respond, I think journalism has a really important role to play so that people don't become passive consumers of information. And also, really importantly, we are able to hold politicians and power to account by saying, actually, what's happening here is you're making a choice, or you've decided to make this policy happen, not, and rather than letting them off the hook by this sort of like, oh, that's just the way it is, like the kind of like there is no alternative concept. There is an alternative, and the media has a role to sort of like start to highlight that and to question that. Changing tack a little bit, I think this would be really important for us to start connecting the dots between between the big issues and making them relatable and local and human and personalized. Sometimes the climate crisis, for example, can seem far off in time or in distance, or it's something that happens to others or other people or in other scenarios. But for us to kind of like help precipitate this cultural change and political change that we need, we're going to need to connect these big issues and the complex policies and events to people's day-to-days, whether that's their jobs, families, immediate environment, in a way that brings it home to their doorstep, to their living room, to their workplace. And that's in a way where kind of like diversity comes in terms of diversity of types of journalism. So as well as, of course, the sort of like diversity of voices and experiences that can help as broad a possible group of people and groups of people within our communities and society to connect on a more human level and to relate to the experiences of what's happening and see how what's happening to a certain individual is connected to the sort of like big conceptual policy issues or political issues that we see in the news. And I think this also will help us to sort of like break out, or at the very least grow, the echo chamber that was kind of mentioned in the brief here, in that we have like diverse people and perspectives, and publishing approaches will reach more people, be able to connect with more people and make it hit people on the sort of like emotional level, but in a way that feels sort of empowering as well. We also need to stop beating around the bush and call out the bullshit. I think a lot of like there's this sort of like journalism has this sort of like hang up about sort of like reporting he said, she said, or like sort of like taking statements from governments or companies or whatever that are weak, or could be greenwashing, where it's like a sort of like looks like environmentally friendly but isn't really. And I think it's important that we sort of start to have the confidence to be like, no, actually, this isn't supported by action. This is a kind of like empty statement, or this is a weak statement. And I think there's a positive sign there, though, that it is in a way, a sign of progress that oil companies even now feel compelled to kind of like make statements about the climate crisis, but we need to make sure that they don't hide behind that, and we actually push them to action or abolition, I guess. But this is also tempered by acknowledging the progress and highlighting and amplifying positive and hopeful initiatives as well. Like, we really need the hopeful aspects as well as the kind of like hard-edged thing. And finally, we need a media ecosystem that is actively, and this is the rub, financially supported by the public to make it happen. Like, the current model cannot support this sort of journalism because it's reliant on like clickbait, it's reliant on sensationalism, it's completely or not completely, but massively within the hands of proprietors and distant remote shareholders who don't care for the content or for the cultural impact of journalism, but care about it as a financial commodity and as an investment. And the only way that we can wrest that back is if we start to create and build our own and get behind it. And in that way, we can also demand it does better. And I would probably summarize this as saying that we would start to see media as a public good or a service that has a big responsibility to the public, much like any other public service, schools, NHS, whatever. Because if we don't support it, then it won't be able to sustain or work well. And then we also won't be able to demand it does better. So that would be some parts of my vision for how to get to 2040 with regards to the media. Thank you.